Happy Sunday. Aesop once said, "A man is known by the company he keeps." Probably said that in Greek. I don't know what it is in Greek. But a man is known by the company he keeps. If we're called to know Jesus, then, as we are as Christians, it would seem we must know the company he kept, right? But that's a subject we've covered pretty well in more general terms. We all know that Christ didn't spend time with kings and religious officiates. He spent time with working women, thieves, beggars, and lepers. But again, that's a generalization. Who did Jesus specifically spend time with? Because I kind of feel like Aesop probably wasn't just referring to I don't even know I don't know Aesop's fables well enough. Mr. Fox hanging out with all the foxes probably meant pretty specifically Mr. Fox hanging out with this one specific fox. So who did Jesus specifically spend time with? And that's what I'd like to discuss. Jesus' close friends and associates. In choosing which one to start with, because I think I'm going to do a few of these here over couple weeks. I have to admit, I went with the one that I most feel like I get, that makes sense to me. I'm like, yeah, dude, you make sense. Being a follower of Christ and calling oneself a seeker or a saint isn't always easy. There's this weight to being Christian, to following Christ, to walking with Christ. And a sense of being responsible for Christ and his message. I mean, doing these messages, I'm very directly responsible for Christ and his message, right? Taking that weight onto your shoulders of being responsible for that. There's also, for me personally, as a Christian, this ever-worrying sense of hypocrisy. How can I, an extremely flawed person, be worthy of calling myself a disciple of Christ, being someone who claims to keep Christ's company, if you will? So, of the people that were close to Christ, who does that describe? And probably a few of you out in the audience are shouting Judas, hopefully. Judas asked many of these same questions and expressed many of these same struggles. Fairly famously in the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, but also in the Gospels, both canonized and apocryphal and otherwise. So I feel like I get Judas. Please don't say I'm damned for all time. Who was Judas Iscariot? Obviously, he was one of the 12 apostles, in Judea at least. In our tradition, there's actually some more apostles. But Judas, he was one of the 12 in Judea. His last name meant man of Kerioth, or Kerioth. He was from the tribe of Judah and was the only apostle who was not a Galilean, which I did not know until I was putting together this message and reading about Judas. If I'm reading it correctly, Judas and Jude are the same name. I didn't know that when I named my son. So, but it's kind of like, I think, Jesus and Joshua being related names, but only one person could be called Jesus when they were kind of translating the names. So that's my understanding. We don't really know where Judas came from or even how he received his calling from Christ. There's not really that origin story for Judas like there is for some of the other apostles. The only disciple who gets more coverage in the Gospels than Judas is Peter. So we don't get Judas's origin story, but we sure do hear a lot about him. And yes, spoiler alert, we'll cover Peter another week, but save him. He's a little more difficult. And so we don't know a ton about where Judas came from other than Kerioth, whatever that is. He's just one of Jesus' disciples. He just kind of is there. Kind of wonder why that is. Some of the research I read said they felt like that suggested he was less historical than the others. That's a argument I don't feel like even vaguely diving into, but I'd like to think that it's because Judas was a true believer and a close friend of Jesus. Kind of when in normal day-to-day life, just in everyday life, you find out that your friend Sally and your coworker Jim know each other. Well, that's when you ask for the origin story, right? That's when you're like, how did you two meet? I didn't know you knew each other, Sally. We play cards together, and Jim, I work with you. How did you two? I didn't know that. Well, tell me about this, right? That's when you question it. But when you go hang out with Jim and he's like, this is my buddy George, and then every time you see Jim outside of work, George is always around. You probably don't ask a lot of questions about how Jim and George met, really, right? It's just there they are. Maybe eventually you do, but overall you just kind of go, oh, that's Jim and George. I don't know. They just pal around together. That's what they do. That's Jesus and Judas. Judas is just hanging around Jesus. He's just his friend. He's just the guy that was there. We might be tempted to think that Judas was distrusted from the start, that Judas was somehow always the shady one, right? However, his job within the early church was as the treasurer, basically, as the accountant. He was the one that was given the money purse to be carried by the disciples. At least that's what we're told in the Gospel of John. He carried the church funds in a bag with him. And it does say he occasionally pilfered from those funds. While the trust might have been misplaced then by the disciples, clearly, and by Jesus, clearly Judas must have been pretty trusted by everyone if they let him hold the money, right? You don't let just some weirdo hold the money. That's somebody you trust. That trust then must have been put not just in Judas by the disciples, but as I just said, by Christ himself, right? It's not just the disciples that are trusting him. And I said the trust might have been misplaced, but if Jesus put the trust in Judas, are we going to assume that Jesus was wrong? That Jesus made a mistake? He didn't know Judas's true nature? So Jesus, the man on whom our entire faith rests, we're going to say that he was wrong about one of the 20 people who knew him really well? I mean, it doesn't seem to be a huge pool of people around him. That wouldn't be very good odds if true, that Jesus knew human nature so little that of this very small pool of people around him, he got one wrong. So I don't think that's true. I don't think it could be true, right? Because we all have those close friends and relatives for whom we make allowances. Sure, they nick $1 or $2 out of the jar every now and again, but the get-togethers wouldn't be the same without them. And when the chips are down, those disciples, those friends, those relatives, they're there, right? I mean, we don't have disciples, that's Jesus, but you know what I'm saying. The friends, the relatives, these people we make allowances for, they're there for us in some way. So I have to believe that Jesus not only trusted Judas, but Jesus felt he had reason to. Again, Judas is discussed more than any other disciple with the exception of Peter. Well, apostle, with the exception of Peter. This was arguably Christ's closest friend and confidant. That argument could be made. If we believe that Judas was pure, unredeemable evil, then we'd have to accept that Christ couldn't tell good people from bad people. That Jesus had no idea how human nature worked, or any ability to read people. And doing that would then just close the Bible and we're not going to worry about it, right? It would completely unravel our faith. So we absolutely have to accept the worth of Judas to accept the authority of Jesus. Because if we want to accept that Jesus brought Judas into his inner circle, and we want to have faith in what Christ is supposed to be and represent, we have to believe that Jesus knew who Judas was. Maybe in a way we don't. And I think that's a hard thing to do, harder than we often realize. Because it's easy to hate and hard to forgive. And boy, don't I know it. I mean, if you do something awful to me, honestly, I'm gonna be real angry at you. And somebody once said of me, I think I used the meme last week. There's a meme, an elephant. It says elephants never forget and they never forgive. I definitely deal with that issue. Cross me and I will not forget it. But I'll try. And I'll remind myself that this anger and this need to just be Charles Bronson and get revenge, that really it's crazy. It's just crazy. And just kind of try to let that part go. And that's harder. Because rash, angry, lashing out at people whom we deem to be wrong, that's easy. Trying to let go of all that, that's hard. And I think it's hard too because I think we have trouble defining forgiveness sometimes. The Gospels say specifically that Satan entered Judas. Right there at the Last Supper, Satan dwelt in Judas. It says that in the Gospels. And the Gospel of Luke suggests that wasn't the only moment that Satan entered Judas. Often Judas was a temple for Satan. Judas stole. He was a thief. Ultimately, he betrayed Jesus. We know all of that, right? So we can't forgive in the sense of just saying, oh, that's okay. You were just having a bad day, little buddy. Right? If we're trying to define forgiveness, there is that definition of forgiveness that's like, oh, hey, that's okay. Don't worry about it. In Midwestern terms, whoops, sorry. Right? Forgiveness of that kind is, I'm going to argue, a little silly. And it's a waste of effort. Because it's effortless. That kind of forgiveness isn't hard necessarily. And it's often the kind of forgiveness that's called for by bullies, to be honest. They'll say, hey, you just need to learn to forgive me, while you're screaming, I hate you, please stop hitting me. Right? They're just like, and you're like, I hate you, stop hitting me. And they're like, you just need to learn to forgive and let this go, right? Have you had that happen? I've had it happen. Because they're currently beating you, like, right that very second. Or maybe, like, they were 3 minutes earlier, right? And you know that they're going to beat you again tomorrow. Like, you know, you can forgive them, but you can't be like, bygones be bygones, because you got beat now and you're getting beat tomorrow. The beatings will continue until morale improves. So blind forgiveness like that, it's not forgiveness. And it's too easy to offer. I mean, it sounds hard, but it's not, because that's just, you just go, oh, whatever, okay, never mind. It's easy. Since it's not in here. So what is real forgiveness? How should we define that? It's a hard thing to answer. I suppose when it comes to Judas, forgiveness has to look something like distance without judgment. Buddha once said that holding anger in your heart for another is like holding a burning coal in your own hand and hoping it will burn them. Did you catch that? Holding hate in your heart for another is like holding coal, a hot coal, in your own hand, squeezing it tight and hoping it'll burn that other person. You can't waste your time hating someone else. But at the same time, you can't be foolish enough to just bygones be bygones and let them back in. Judas isn't to be trusted, but he isn't to be hated either. Christ didn't hate him. He was Christ's friend. What could Jesus have possibly seen in him? There is actually a Gospel of Judas. It's not anything modern. I mean, it's ancient. We've got like one copy that dates from 280 A.D., so like back to pretty early Christianity. And that copy might have been preceded by earlier versions. That doesn't necessarily mean it was written in 280 A.D. And according to the Gospel of Judas, which is non-canonical, Judas saw Jesus' mission as a heavenly one. So the Judas in the Gospel of Judas, he sees Jesus' mission as being about heaven, not about earth. And so then Judas was the only one of the disciples to see it that way. The others were concerned with the immediate politics of their land, Judea and Rome and all that kind of stuff, and they continued kind of with the traditions of animal sacrifice and those kinds of worship styles that were popular in the Middle East around 33 A.D. But Judas, according to the Gospel of Judas, saw Christ's mission as being more concerned with dwelling in that kingdom within. The Gospel of Judas then puts Judas' disagreement with the sacrifice of Jesus into context, because Judas actually already rejected the sacrifice of animals. He rejected that whole thing. He didn't think that was necessary to appease God. And he kind of condemned the practices that are implicit in communion, which is the consumption and adoration kind of the sacrificed flesh. Because when they would sacrifice the animals, they would burn the meats and all that and then consume them, right? And so Judas kind of rejected all that worldly way of worship. Judas believed that resurrection had more to do with a transmigration of the soul rather than kind of any bodily immortality in this physical realm. So it's non-canonical. But if that's Judas's point of view, then I think an argument could be made that Judas was very forward-thinking in his Christianity. He was a thief. He had his moments when Satan took him, and Judas acted wrongly against the people he loved. But maybe, and this is a stretch, but it is supported by the Gospel of Judas, maybe Judas was the only one of Christ's contemporary disciples to understand that Jesus' mission was one of the soul, and not one of this Saha world. Saha world's a Buddhist term, kind of meaning this physical world, the illusion that we are all trapped in of money and power and bodily things. So isn't that kind of interesting to think of Judas as like the only disciple who really got it? Wouldn't that be fascinating? And it puts Judas's struggle in a very human light, I think. Here's a man who believes in the soul and the power of God to heal the spirit rather than the flesh. The miracles that drew Judas to Jesus weren't the ones that caught everybody else, like, big heaps of fish and curing the blind and those kinds of things, those physical things. The miracles that captured Judas's imagination, again, according to this non-canon gospel, but it is an ancient one, they were miracles of the soul. Moments when Jesus helped to change people's minds and spirits. It puts the moment with the perfume that we mentioned, I think that was last week also, into a strange and interesting context. Because here's Judas, the accountant for the church, complaining that they shouldn't have wasted money on perfume when it could have gone to the poor. That's a very worldly and even charitable concern on Judas's part, right? Then When Jesus chastises Judas for caring more about worldly wealth and poverty than the aesthetic beauty and its effect on the spirit, it seems maybe a little out of character, but maybe Jesus was calling Judas back to Judas's own faith, rather than accusing Judas of being stingy with the church prophets and just wanting to waste them on the never-ending hordes of poor people. Doesn't that kind of sound more like Jesus? So to kind of reframe that again, what if Jesus wasn't saying, Judas, we'll always have the poor, you won't always have me, to mean give up, I'm not worried, that Jesus wasn't worried about the poor. What if he was saying, Judas, the concerns of the world, that's not the apostle you are. The concerns of the soul and the spirit, that's the apostle you are, and I think better of you. What if Jesus wasn't saying, forget about all those poor people. I'll be dead soon and I want to smell good when I go. Maybe he was saying, Judas, my friend, you're not the one who worries about the world and its troubles. I'll be gone soon, and in this moment, our souls are lifted by sharing in something beautiful. Enjoy the moment, Judas. Let your soul shine. And maybe that's why Jesus loved Judas. For its worth, on this same line of thought, according to the Gospels, Judas did throw the 30 pieces of silver he received for betraying Christ back to the church elders and then went and hung himself for what he'd done. Judas rejected the worldly good and feared more for the fate of his soul. I feel like I get Judas because I'm not a great guy. I screw up a lot. I lose sight of what I hold holy and dear a lot. But I also try. I try really hard to be a friend to Christ and Christians, those who bear his name, and all people. Maybe the next time you see someone whom you care for, but who also never quite lives up to your expectations, but it just wouldn't be the same without them. Maybe the next time that happens, remember Judas. And remember that Christ loved Judas too. Have a great week. God bless.